Born in 1922, Irving Goffman was a Canadian-American sociologist who was considered by some to be the most influential American sociologist of the 20th century. In 1956, Goffman penned one of his masterpieces called The Presentation of the Self in Everyday Life. In it, he outlined his dramaturgical view of social interaction, which argues that humans are composed of many selves rather than just one. Meanwhile, across the pond in France, world-renowned philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre was busy at work on ideas similar to Goffman's. Born in 1905, Sartre was perhaps the most influential of the group of philosophers known as the existentialists. Sartre, as argued in his 1943 masterpiece Being and Nothingness, believed that humans do not possess a single unchanging self, and for this reason, his work is intimately related to Goffman's. In this video, I will provide an overview of Goffman and Sartre's views of human personal identity. I will show that although they have similar views in what human personal identity consists of, they draw nearly opposite conclusions from this premise. To begin, neither Goffman nor Sartre believed in the standard view of personal identity. The view that is shared by most people goes something like this. Deep down, beneath everything that I've ever done or anything that I've ever thought, felt, or desired, there is my real self. This is the self that I always was and always will be. I may not always act or think in ways that are good representations of this self, but nonetheless, it is always there in the background. In reality, we get this conception of the self from the 18th century movement known as Romanticism. It was the Romantics who first conceived of the self as a person's unchanging inner core. To them, and still to many of us, the point of life is to express the individuality of that inner core. However, the idea that humans possess an unchanging, deeper self has not always been the most popular view. For instance, in ancient Greece, the majority of people understood themselves in terms of teleological metaphysics. Basically, teleological metaphysics entails explaining things by saying that they are striving to fulfill their natural purpose. In regards to humans, proponents of this view would argue that people simply strive to fulfill their natural purpose, whether that purpose is towards rationality, our society, or God. Therefore, on this view, there is no self beneath our natural purpose. Though Goffman and Sartre would agree with the idea that there is no deeper self, they do so due to phenomenology rather than due to teleological metaphysics. Phenomenology is concerned with studying the world as it appears in consciousness. By contrast, the more common Cartesian method of analysis is concerned with studying the world as it exists independent of consciousness. The reason phenomenology led Goffman and Sartre to reject the notion of a deep, ultimate self is best summed up by David Hume, who wrote, "For my part, when I enter intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." Notice Hume's emphasis on the self as it appears to him in his consciousness. Now, although neither Goffman nor Sartre believed in a deep, unchanging self, the conclusions that they drew from this assertion were wildly different. For Goffman, the idea that there is no fixed self is merely cause for intrigue. For Sartre, our lack of a deeper self is cause for extreme alarm. Basically, his reasoning goes something like this. Because we have no deep down ultimate self, all that we really have is the sum of our experiences. In every single moment of our lives, we create our experiences, whether we want to or not. Therefore, we carry an extreme burden to constitute ourselves in every waking moment. As a result of this split in their reasoning, Goffman and Sartre disagree on how humans can approach living towards a quote-unquote true self. For Goffman, the truest self that we have is our ideal social mask. He writes, "Insofar as this mask represents the conception we have formed of ourselves, the role we are striving to live up to, this mask is our truer self, the self we would like to be. By contrast, for Sartre, The closest that humans can come towards a quote-unquote true self is living with what he calls authenticity. To Sartre, a person lives with authenticity when he realizes that he lacks a deep inner self and therefore acts in ways that are indicative of his absolute freedom. This idea may be easier to conceptualize with an example. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre gives an example of a waiter. He says, "Let us consider this waiter in the cafe. His movement is quick and forward, a little too precise, a little too rapid. He comes toward the patrons with a step a little too quick. He bends forward a little too eagerly. But what is he playing? We need not watch long before we can explain it. He is playing at being a waiter in a cafe." For Sartre, this waiter is living unauthentically, what he calls living in bad faith, because he really believes in his performance as a waiter. He therefore ought to be criticized. For Goffman, this waiter is living with what he calls sincerity, and therefore ought to be commended, precisely because he believes in his performance. In conclusion, although Goffman and Sartre had similar ideas about the constitution of the human self, they drew radically different conclusions from this premise. Those interested in this subject ought to read up on Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, which present a middle ground of sorts between Goffman and Sartre's views of the self.